As I was thinking about the program and thinking about our nation, every nation goes through times of great difficulty. So it should not surprise us that it is time for us to go through some difficulty. From the great impact of the Civil War, a lot of people don't think about this, but Civil War, over 600,000 Americans lost their lives. But there was also the Spanish flu, not a war, the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918, immediately following World War I. World War I, about 117,000 American soldiers lost their lives, but for the Spanish flu outbreak in America alone, 675,000 people lost their lives to what was then a novel flu, meaning it was a new flu to which people did not have natural immunity, later designated Spanish flu. But major weather events have precipitated civil government to temporarily limit the mobility of citizens in our country, not just as it happened there in the Civil War, not just as it happened in the Spanish flu outbreak, but across this country. And sometimes mandates, if you think about it, that hundreds of thousands of people actually leave their homes, as in the case of advancing hurricanes. Well, in such cases, the logical question always is, well, how serious is this threat? And who determines that level of threat? Does civil government have the moral and constitutional right to limit travel, public gatherings, and other association? And how does this impact our U.S. constitutional right of the First Amendment to worship and association and assembly? And of course, how does the church respond in times like this from a civil and biblical perspective? These are questions that are presenting themselves all across the country to serious students of history, constitutionally committed citizens, and biblically based Christians. And we're going to walk through just a little bit of that today, right now. And as I said, I'm going to invite in right now Jeremy Dice, who is Special Counsel for Litigation and Communications for First Liberty, which you can find at their website, firstliberty.org. Jeremy, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Jeremy, you guys are busy because these questions are coming up, and I know you're getting them from around the country. You and I have been in discussion for the last few days relative to what First Liberty could do in assembling a basic set of guidelines for pastors, for religious leaders, and I'm going to put in there constitutionally committed citizens in regard to these actions, these mandates by either state or federal government that's impacting our mobility and our ability to gather, in some cases, somewhat within even the churches. So that being the case, let me start right out with this, if you don't mind. Does the state, get very basic, does the state, either federal or state governments, do either one of those possess the constitutional, and I'm going to insert in here, the moral authority, the constitutional and moral authority to limit peaceful assembly, such as church gatherings, such as what we're seeing right now as a result of the coronavirus?
Well, let's go back and review this through kind of a biblical lens, and remember that government is something that was not man's idea; it was God's idea to begin with, and so we start with that, and the church being God's idea, also, of course, as something that we understand has a special place, I suppose, in God's heart, and He's given certain authority to the state, and He's given certain authority to the church. And at times those two may overlap, but usually they're in separate spheres of authority, and that's good, that's proper, and that's right, and that's why we have, and that's why we insist upon this separation in the right sense of that term, the separation between the authority of the state and the church, and how the church has that influencing authority over the state itself, but the state does not reciprocate in kind. In other words, the church is loath to be able to actually influence or affect the church in most ways. Now, that said, the church certainly recognizes or should recognize that the state has a legitimate governing authority, and it wields the sword, as Paul talks about it, with just authority and in the right times and in the right ways. But to get directly then to your question, does the state then have that authority in times of national crisis, or in this situation, international pandemic, to be able to curtail rights that we would otherwise insist upon under our First Amendment, and which are then attached, of course, to our own humanity, our creation? And the answer to that question is sort of, or maybe how my law school professors used to put every hard question or answer every hard question I would ask. They would say, well, it depends. And that's the case here as well. And so let's first off say that the church needs to continue to maintain its mandate to serve and care for its community. This is a good time for a church in the face of a global pandemic to be what it has always been, except it gets to be a little bit more on center stage because there's a lot of needy people out there right now. There's a great physical need, and there's a design behind the church to care for its people, and for its people then to care for the world as well. This is the time for the church to do that very thing. And so I'm eager for the church, as you guys have described it already, to be doing what it does best, caring for one another and caring for the community around them. But that means that they've got to be able to be free to do so, doesn't it? Well, okay, so there's a pandemic out there, and you've already articulated the different large gathering bans that are in place here. The state does have the authority to say, look, we need to have those large gatherings curtailed. What it does not have the ability to do is to kind of pick and choose who it wants to curtail. And I think we've seen a kind of a clunky start to this quarantining and social distancing thing. For instance, here in Dallas, where I'm at, they put out, the city mayor put out a proclamation that they would have a ban on large gatherings of over, I think it was first 250 people. But then they exempted certain things. They exempted the airports, but you can kind of understand why that would be the case. They then exempted schools and movie theaters, but all other public gatherings of 500 plus were banned. Well, that doesn't make any logical sense, does it? Now, and are you telling me that churches are somehow less germ-ridden than schools and movie theaters? Well, of course not. But at the same time, it makes no legal sense either. There's no difference in terms of raw neutrality between a building that houses 500 churchgoers and 500 moviegoers. There's no difference between those two. And so if we had the desire to have it challenged, or if a church were to push back on all this, I think there's a case to be made. In other words, the state has the ability to burden your religious freedom, even substantially burden it, but only after they demonstrate that they have done so in the least restrictive means possible, and that they have a compelling interest for doing so. I don't think you'll find a court in the country that would disagree that a pandemic on this scale is anything but a compelling interest. And so I think you're going to find most courts agreeing, yeah, they've got a compelling justification for doing this. They, being the state, has a justification, even a compelling one, to make sure that large gatherings are prevented. Excellent. But at the same time, we can insist that our government be much more tailored to what they're doing. In other words, they can't say churches you can't meet, but movie theaters you can. That makes neither logical sense nor legal sense, and we're right to remind our leaders that is the standard we're going to hold them to.
That's great. Jeremy, in your guidelines, First Liberty's second guideline reads, temporary, even applied restrictions may be permissible. I think it's important for the sake of the discussion that we define what temporary means. With that being said, you have mentioned the term temporary in your guidance. Is there any limit to how long temporary can be, and is there any restriction on the size of the assembly?
Well, look, temporary is, I think we just go with what the common definition of the word temporary would be, and that would be defined in the negative sense as being not permanent, right? And so as long as there is kind of an end in sight to this whole thing, then I think they can insist upon the ban on large gatherings and whatever that may be. And just as a kind of a more prudential note here as well, let's not forget that God has given us government for our good, and we have thankfully, in most situations, staffed our government with officials who are, for the most part, fairly wise. And maybe there's a rabbit trail we could follow at another time there to remind ourselves for future elections how important it is in times of crisis like this to have very wise, God-honoring individuals that are within those positions of authority so that they make the appropriate decisions on things. But that's a discussion for a later day. Right now, what we want to remind ourselves of is that we can turn to the government, or we ought to turn to the government to look for answers to these large pandemic problems and how they play out at the national, international, even the local scene. And so, yes, temporarily, it could be 2 weeks, 2 months, or longer. I don't know that the courts would be really in agreement if something were to last years and years. That seems a lot more like a permanent situation than it is a temporary one in any sense of the term temporary. But if, for instance, this pandemic were not to be able to be contained somehow, and in fact it went worse, maybe a 2-year limitation would be okay. But I really would doubt that would be the case, because at the same time, the courts would have to insist upon the government presenting the compelling justification. So long as they can maintain that compelling justification, and that is a really high standard to meet in normal circumstances, they're not going to allow this to drag out forever and ever. So right now, what's the latest CDC guidelines? I think it's a ban on 50 people and going out perhaps 8 weeks. That's temporary enough, and I think compelling enough to probably be okay.